Welcome. This is the After the Glass Break series. I'm your host, David Harrison. Throughout this series, we will take a candid look through the lenses of culturally diverse technology leaders to discuss their rise through the glass ceiling and what happens immediately after the glass break. I'm happy to welcome today's guest, Eric Thomas, who's the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Genesys. Eric, welcome to the ride.
David, thank you, man, and thanks for having me.
Throughout this journey, we want to take the audience into a candid view at you, things you went through as a kid growing up, things you saw, and as you started approaching the glass ceiling, what are some of the other things you saw as you moved toward those paths? So take us through, like, Eric, where'd you grow up? I mean, tell me something about your childhood.
Yeah, interesting. I grew up in a small rural town in West Texas, roughly about 60 miles west of Lubbock, if most folk may know where Lubbock is. Town size was it was a little less than 2,000 people.
Wow.
And the Black population was probably somewhere around 5 or 6%. So it's a farm, it's a cotton and oil town. When I grew up, I don't know what the current statistics are today, but when I grew up there, the town itself, along with 2 or 3 other towns collectively, came together to form Gaines County. And during that period, Gaines County was the #1 producer of cotton and oil in the country in that one small space.
Wow.
And so, and my grandfather, back in the late 50s, looking for work, migrated from East Texas to West Texas. And that's how we end up instantiating a family presence in the West Texas area. Of course, not having an education, the work that was available was farm work. He became a sharecropper, and it was passed down. So he reached back, brought several of his kids and their family. And again, that's what set up the family structure in West Texas, and what I call the family business, which is sharecropping, because I also grew up on a farm. My dad was one of the hands that my grandfather brought with him on the journey. He met my mom on that journey. And I grew up in a farmhouse. That was part of my dad's compensation, as part of the sharecropping compensation. At 8 years old, I had my first job. I was in the cotton field. Right? I was picking cotton and what we call chopping cotton. It's not actually chopping the cotton, but we were weed control. Right? It was much cheaper then to pay hands to go through and kill all the weeds around the crops, the cotton crops, than it was to do some type of mass pesticide. So I had my first job at 8 years old in the cotton field, working alongside my dad and other family members and relatives and cousins from the extended family that my grandfather had migrated to that West Texas area. So that, like I said, that was kind of the family business, right? And I grew up for a majority of my childhood in that house, on that farm property, and expanded to doing other things, building irrigation systems and fences and all these other things that are associated with basically maintaining a farm. Right. As a kid. And I can remember the first time I got a Social Security card. I became a legal worker. I went to the local grocery store and applied for a role there, and I pestered that store manager until he hired me to get out in cotton field. And from the age 16 until I graduated from high school, I worked at a grocery store, a local grocery store, as a courtesy clerk, bagging groceries, stocking shelves, and those types of things. I can never remember not having a job, even as the 8-year-old kid. In terms of education, a small town, so it's a small school environment.
Right.
I was the only Black person in my class. Yeah, believe it or not, a small class. It was less than 50 of us, but I was the only Black person in the class.
Wow.
And what made it even more interesting, because I was a straight A student, they pulled me out of the general population and put me in a much smaller group of us in what they call the talent. I think they call them talented and gifted programs today. And I pretty much grew up with that small group from first grade all the way through graduation. It was probably about 12 of us in there. And again, I was the only Black in the group.
Right.
And so, it just kind of gives you a sense of the town itself, the environment, the industries that were available, The
Yeah.
jobs that were available for you, if you lived in that town, there was no corporate buildings, there was no corporate America, if you will. The white collar roles were, if you were educated, you were a teacher or you worked for the school system.
Right.
You weren't educated, you worked in the oil field if you were blessed enough because it paid, a pretty decent living, but it didn't require an education. And then if you weren't in the oil fields, then you were in the cotton fields. And as you might imagine, the majority of those cotton field jobs went to people of color.
Yeah.
The majority of the oil field jobs went to the white community that lived in that area. And then again, if you were educated, most likely transient, you were a teacher or a coach or you worked for the school system. And that was kind of my background in the town I grew up in.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. And thanks for letting the audience understand that, in today's societal thought process, people don't think about sharecroppers in the modern day era. They don't think about cotton pickers or out field hands in the modern day era. When they see Black America, they say, "Oh, that was 200 years ago."
Yeah,
Right.
no, that's not the case, brother. That is still very real today, very real. And David, it's interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about this as I'm sharing, kind of thinking through the town itself. I am the first college graduate in my family, and when you think about growing up in an environment like that, in that type of ecosystem where you don't see a lot of folk going off to college, you don't see professional Black executives. It's not your norm. It is something that that you have to break through to create a new norm. And
Exactly.
when I think about your podcast about after the glass breaks, me leaving that town, my ability to kind of navigate those situations and actually be able to go off and go to college and play college football and get a degree and become the first graduate in my family, that was probably the first breaking of the glass because that was not the norm. That's not what was happening around me. A lot of my friends and others who look like me, if you did graduate from high school and you were fortunate, you might go work in the oil field, or you may go. I have a friend of mine that at that grocery store where I worked as a kid, that became his profession. And that's what he does today, right? So it
Right.
wasn't the norm to leave that town and get a college education and find some type of path towards corporate America. That was probably the first breaking of the glass.
And I talked about this in my initial episode around that 3 mile radius mentality, right? You can't be what you can't see, right? So that's what was present. And so typically you fall into what you see because you have no other at the time. And you're not of the age that internet and cable TV wasn't available to us to know that the world was bigger than that 3 mile radius of that small town that we played in as kids.
Right.
And that in itself draws me into another question. Like you mentioned that, your role models were just people you saw. So how did you get the desire? What made you believe that, hey, I need to leave this town? How do I get through that first glass ceiling, as you just mentioned? What drove you? Like, who was some of the people that gave you inspiration to move forward in spite of?
So my father, I'm trying to manage my emotions here. I lost my dad it'll be 10 years this December to cancer.
Mhm.
David, that was probably the hardest working man that I've ever known in my life.
Yeah.
My dad had a sixth grade education because during that time, when, it was leaving elementary school, trying to get into the next echelon, middle school, and whatever it may be. And you had a choice. You can walk 5 miles one way to the next segregated school for Black kids, or you can go to work in the fields and help provide for the family. And he lost his father at a very, very young age. I think my dad was maybe 9 years old. And he was one of the older males in the family. So it really wasn't a choice. It is, you
Right.
need to go and find and help provide for the family. So kind of like me, he'd been working from a very, very young age. And the work ethic, unmatched. My dad would have his regular job working for one farmer, sharecropping. Eventually, we left the farm. And interesting story. My dad um, became a politician in a sense. One of the farmers that we worked for was running for county commissioner.
Mm.
He enlisted my dad to help rally the black vote. And he promised my dad, if you help me win, I will get you off this farm and I will make you a city employee. That's a huge jump, right? Because you
Wow.
go from being on a farm, no benefits, no future, no retirement, nothing. You're working for week to week wages. To becoming a city employee with a retirement pension plan, benefits. I can go to the dentist for the first time at age like what, 13 or 14, whenever it was, that type of thing. Long story short, he ended up helping the individual. The guy won, and he lived up to his promise. My dad became a city employee. We moved in town. Actually, we bought a house for the first time. He was able to buy his first home. But even though he had his regular day job, he never left the farm. So my dad would work during the week, and we didn't do vacations. We didn't do Disney World. We didn't do Martha's Vineyard. We didn't do any of those things that my kids have had privilege of seeing.
Yeah.
When my dad had vacation, his vacation was back on the farm. And guess who was with him? Me. So, and again, and the cotton fields, it blooms throughout the year, and then it has to be harvested by a certain time. And
Yeah.
if you harvest it by a certain time, then you could lose a lot of your crops. Lost crops is lost revenue. And so my dad's relationship with these farmers, he would go out on his vacation time and we'd be up till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember sometime on those tractors harvesting, and he would take so he could get some rest. He'd fall asleep. I'd take over and kind of finish out the night till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I remember having conversations with my dad where he was a proud person, but he was also humble in a way where he would say, you see the life that I live, right? You understand what I have to do to provide for us. It was always visible. And he goes, this is not the life for you. Your life is to become educated, get you an education, and you have these folk working for you. And so just the example that he set as a hardworking individual, the work ethic itself, his ability to navigate, employment without an education, and then those gems that he would drop on me when the time that we spent together, mostly working with him, helping him whatever odd jobs he had, by showing me this is not your life. I do this so that you can have a better life. And oh, by the way, the man adopted me. I'm not his natural born son. So this is a time in the 70s when a lot of men were already struggling with taking care of their own children. He adopts me and brings me in and provides me this life and this work ethic. So when you ask me about someone I look up to, that's the first person that comes to mind, because that was my first example of perseverance.
That is a real testament to strength and character right there. I think, and again, minding my emotions, as you said, I'm listening to you and listening to your story, and I'm seeing my mom the way you're seeing your dad, as far as a hero and a driver, and someone that we model ourselves after. Because similar to you, I've been working since I was 9 years old. And, I helped my mom clean houses growing up. My mom and my grandmother were maids for most of their young adult life. My grandmother was a maid throughout her entire life. And so we get up at 5 a.m. My grandma would say before day. You got to get up before day.
4 day, yeah.
And you got to go out. We just go and clean apartment buildings and clean houses. And then by 8 o'clock, we're back and I'm going off to school. And that was me growing up. And then in the summer, we had summer youth employment that I just go to work. And because, there was no extras growing up in our world. It was always just enough, and sometimes not enough in that environment. So kudos to that. That is a riveting story of, passion and power and character. I mean, you have Ali behind you, and as you're telling that story, I'm thinking of a great Ali quote. The back of a champion doesn't belong on the mat. So
Right.
when you go down, you must get up.
And it's interesting you say that, because one of the things I'm always careful of when sharing these stories is I am in no way trying to paint myself as a victim.
Yes,
I don't believe that any of us who had these types of experiences were victims. I think that, if anything else, that scar tissue that was gained from those experiences created superpowers for us
that is correct.
and allowed us to navigate the water that we had to navigate later, right? So just to be clear, no victim mentality here.
That is correct.
Those were the realities of the environments that I grew up in.
That is unbelievable. I love that. And so you have your dad's work ethic, you have your dad's strength. And now, when I was in the 8th grade, we were bused to the north side of the town. And I love this story because it's really funny, because I didn't know. And because, there was hidden barriers that we never went north when I was growing up, because if you're up there at nightfall, you could be in trouble as a young Black man. It wasn't until I was in 8th grade that I realized that we were poor. And then, so it's funny that you talked about moving from the farm to the city with your dad, and around the same time that, I got bused to the north side of town, and I didn't know at the time that we were a lower income family. I just didn't know, because everyone around me looked like me and we did the same things, and I hadn't seen that side of the town yet. And so that's funny. And then the same thing, my mom ended up going and nursing school later on in her life and became a nurse. So take me to now. You're graduating from high school. You're going off to college for the first time. Tell me about that experience. Tell me, what made you decide to push through that first wall, that glass ceiling of not falling into the norms of what you saw around you, but knew there had to be something else out there outside your father telling you that this is not what you want to be.
So I ended up I went to college. Football was the route that got me there, but it was actually my education, GPA, and graduating status. Because I ended up going to college on an academic scholarship, but I played football because it was my love. And I later converted to a football scholarship when I realized, hey, wait a minute, you're not paying me to be here. Like I don't have this, I'm not under the same restrictions as some of the other athletes. I have to maintain a 3.6 to keep my scholarship. I'm freshman newcomer of the year, like, you need to pay me. So we negotiated that, and I ended up on a football scholarship for the remaining years. But, even though my dad had instilled that push around education, it wasn't the norm that I saw around me. And so, I think back on it, and I think that can create this oppressive mind state that you have this fear of failure, right? And the last thing any of us want, if you're breaking that initial glass and you're trying to go off and do something that no one else is doing, failing and coming back and having to fall back in that environment can probably be worse than never leaving, right? And I guess it depends on how you look at it. And I can remember, I tell a lot of, when I mentor, I tell kids this story so they can understand the realities of breaking through this oppressive mindset. I was scheduled to report in August for football on a Thursday. And I can remember the week leading up to me leaving, this level of anxiety starting to accumulate, and this fear of closing the chapter that I'd known all my life and trying to open a new chapter, and all the unknowns that was associated with that new chapter. Your mind began to race as an 18-year-old kid, and that anxiety and that fear was building. And I was scheduled to leave on a Thursday. That's when my parents knew, hey, this was the day we're going to get him moved in. I woke up on a Tuesday morning at home. My mom and dad were at work, staring at the ceiling. I loaded up my truck, David, and I left. Now, the school I went to, I grew up in West Texas, and I went to Eastern New Mexico University. So it was only a 3-hour drive from home. It wasn't a long trip. I called the coach and I said, "Hey, can I move into the dorms early?" He goes, "Yeah, the doors are open. You can move in. Football dorms open." I left, got my stuff, moved in, picked up the phone and called my mom about 3 in the afternoon at work. Said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, like, I'm here. I decided to leave early." And she's like, "What? No, you didn't do that." I said, "Yeah, Mom, I did." And so of course she's upset on the phone because I robbed her of the experience of being able to see me off and all this other type of thing. But I told her, I said I had to. I said, because if I'd have waited till Thursday, I might not have left. And it was something in me that Tuesday morning that said, you need to get up and go now.
Right.
And it's a mindset in that town, growing up in that town, that environment, that picture I painted you, that says, if you look like me, this is not the norm. This is not your future. So for someone to be able to walk into it knowing that this is not the norm, like that takes a totally different mindset. That takes, I don't even know the word to describe it. But that was my first push at saying, my dad has been telling me my entire life growing up, even though I can't see it, this is not your life. Your life exists somewhere else.
Right.
Couldn't paint the picture, didn't have the vision, but it started with a college education. So I had to go. So I
Now
went
that,
off. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, I'm just saying that is again, that content really does set the image and the imagery around, and I call it the in spite of mentality. I won't be brought down because of, I will succeed in spite of. And again, no victim mentality here. I don't see us as victims. I see us as we just went through what we went through in order to gain the intestinal fortitude to push forward. Right.
Right. Right.
So with that in spite of mentality, now you've broken your first glass ceiling, which was interesting because I've always knew when I was a kid there had to be something bigger than my environment.
Right.
You had an inkling, but wasn't sure what it was. So we both, and you went through that glass ceiling, that first ceiling within your life, which is basically doing the unthinkable, getting up and just leaving, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, packing up, I'm going through this, I will make my way and then figure it out. Now you're coming out of school, you're coming out of college, and now you're going in or thinking about going into corporate America. What made you think that that would be the proper direction for you?
It was it's kind of linked to what I just said about not really having a vision, but you had this image, and it was I'm going to be a businessman. I had no clue what a businessman was. I
Yeah.
just knew it wasn't a farmer, and it wasn't working in the oil field or at the grocery store. It's a businessman, and there's this image of getting up and going to work every day with a suit and tie and earning a whole lot of money and being able to give money back to my parents so they can be in a better financial situation. That's what it was. And I think, I ended up getting a business degree. I ended up getting a dual degree in business and human resource management. And I ended up in Dallas working for a technical recruiting firm because I thought I was going to go the HR route initially, and recruiting was one of the disciplines that would open the door for me in HR. I also ended up in Dallas because at the time I met my college sweetheart. We got engaged, and Dallas is where she wanted to go. And so she followed me to Dallas, and we celebrated our 25th anniversary this past August, but she followed me
Oh,
to Dallas.
beautiful.
And that's how I got here and got started in the industry as a technical recruiter. I, again, still not really having a clear vision on where this was going, but just taking the work ethic and all the other things that my dad had instilled in me that allowed me to keep pushing. It was kind of almost one foot in front of the other, if you will. Not
Right.
really almost having a clear vision, just knowing that I needed to keep moving forward. And that's how I ended up in Dallas.
Very nice. All right. So you're taking the recruiter route. You're trying to find your way, as you just mentioned. What made you make the next step, right? So typically we hadn't seen or understood the networking and the variables that are required to go to the next step. Typically, like you just said, you graduate from college, you got your first job in your area where you came from, you made it.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, exactly. Even though I wasn't making any money, all appearances I'd made it. I don't know, man. I think that was again that push. I can remember as a technical recruiter, the company I worked for, they had a system, and you had to make 50 calls a day. It was a very systematic approach at recruiting. At a database where you do greenfield building of a pipeline of candidates, and you have to make at least 50 calls a day. And I can remember, okay, that's what you told me, so that's what I need to do, right? And I'm filling, I got a little clipboard, everybody's got their clipboard, I'm going through all my calls, updating it. You might get through 40 calls, and it's 6 o'clock. I'm getting my 50 calls, because that's what I'm supposed to do. So I might not get home till 7 o'clock in the evening. I didn't know that one of the executives whose office was right behind me was paying attention to this. And he would pay, when I'd come in the morning, he was always the first one there. And sometimes when we leave in the evening, I may be one of the last ones to leave, or he may be one of the last ones to leave. No mentality or no notion at the time of what that meant and what it meant to him and what he was seeing. Long story short, I didn't recruit for 6 months. 6 months in, he plucked me out of that role, and I had my first promotion, now managing a team of recruiters. And that was my first position in kind of a leadership position, but it was very early. It was 6 months out of college.
Wow.
Right? And he was probably my first sponsor, if you will, because it was someone who had a position of power, who recognized what I was putting out. And it wasn't just the work of just, hey, he's here early and late. I was also filling more positions than any other recruiter in the office, even though I was less than 6 months in. And you had people that had been recruiting for a couple of years. I had a pace where I'm filling at least one job a week, which was not the pace that was the norm for them. And so that was probably my first notion of understanding there's more to this. There's gamesmanship, there is relationship. Oh, he's paying attention. There's work ethic can pay off. And oh, by the way, what does he do?
Exactly. What is his job?
Nice office back here, and a nice, 4-door American car as an executive. You know, it was a Cadillac because the company you had to drive 4-door American cars. And so I went and knocked on his door one evening, and he said, "Hey," and this was after the promotion, and he said, "What's up?" I said, "Hey, can you tell me a little bit about what you do, and how you got to the role?" So he shared with me his journey. David, that's what opened my eyes to say, hey, this is real. This is a possibility, and this is real. And then what had been up until that point, a very blurred approach. I went from the one foot in front of the other, and now the vision started coming into view.
Very nice.
This is a possibility.
Very nice. So you've got that first sponsor. He's helping you paint the vision of what could be. So let's fast forward now. So you're sitting at the director's chair. Now you've made it to your junior executive seat, and you're now ready to go to that next level, right? You're now ready to move into, like I said, getting closer to the cockpit and understanding how the plane is actually flown. So what was the intimation on you to go, hey, I can be a vice president, I can do this? And then once you made it through that move, what was your immediate feelings of, if I mess this up, what's going to happen?
So I had an individual that came into my life. At the time, as you said, I was a director, and I was probably one of the youngest directors. This is during my days at Alcatel prior to coming to Ericsson, where you and I met, right?
Right.
I was working in the microwave group, which is one of the oldest technologies in telecom. So that you can imagine the professionals in there are very tenured. There were literally individuals doing the jobs that had been doing it longer than I've been breathing. Literally, I had folk on my team as a director. And our VP general manager retired. They brought in this other individual who was the same age as me, by the way. I think I was about 32 at the time. And I'm thinking, 32 years old, I'm a director. Hey, I made it,
I'm done.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm good. Hey, nobody else around me in my personal ecosystem is doing what I'm doing. So I'm that dude. And he comes in, and like any leader, assessing the landscape of leaders and who he's got in certain roles. And I didn't know we were the same age. I thought I just assumed he was like a lot older because he had a senior vice president title.
Right.
And long story short, we were in his office one day and we were talking about business and certain things, my remit and certain deliverables, closing revenue at the end of the month, those type of things. He goes, hey, he said, I got a question for you. He said, how long are you gonna play small ball? I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, you seem to be very content with where you are. He's like, but you run circles around a lot of the other folk in this group, some with more senior titles than you. What's your, what's your plan? Like, when are you going to stop playing small ball and actually basically live up to your potential? I'm rephrasing what he said.
Right.
And I'm looking at this guy like, And he said, how old are you? And I said, I'm 32. He said, and I saw you. I'm like, how old are you? Now we got a little, he said, I'm 33. And I just like, what? He goes, yeah. He goes, you can do this job, but you have to decide. Like, so when are you going to stop playing small ball? So long story short, he lit a fire. He lit a fire underneath me. And not only did he light a fire, when he made his next move, he became a sponsor.
Right.
So I knew in that conversation from his eyes, this is not just my boss telling me this. This is someone who has actually traversed these waters at a young age.
Right.
He told me, get it in gear because you're settling into this role where you're going to be content and you can do way more than what you're doing. And so then he became a sponsor. And so when he left, I took over his job. It was my first VP nom.
Very nice. Very nice. That's one thing that it is important for the audience to understand is because we talked about before the vision, and we didn't have the networking. We didn't understand the nomenclature. It took us a while to figure out the way, and it takes one. That's all it takes. And for my listening audience, hear me on this. It only takes one to ignite someone.
Right. It only takes one. And Dave, the other thing that I will tell you, there's a common thread. If you connect the dots from the town I grew up in, the atmosphere, the culture of that town, and me playing small ball, as he put it, right? That's not a reframing. Those were his exact words. That conversation lifted the veil. Because up until that point, I still had doubts of, hey, I can do more.
Yeah.
I did more. It was great. Hey, I've earned this. I'm good. And then more would come, but it wasn't a pursuit. He lifted the veil, that oppressive veil that I had been carrying with me from growing up in that town, that with every step I made, with every progress I made, it was like amazing. Oh, wow, this is another great thing, right? Because this wasn't even the vision and it wasn't even attainable in my mind, but I've achieved it. I went from that to going, okay, now I need to start thinking about beyond the veil, beyond this oppressive veil that I came from, that the sky is limited. What I decide to do is on me. Yeah. What I achieve is on me. There aren't any limits, right? And it took a while to get past that mindset. And that conversation was the fire that lit, hey, I'm done operating with the suppressive mindset that I'm just going to give what they take. Well, I'm going to take what they give me and be good with it, especially if I know there's more that can be done.
Yeah. And what you just described is the final glass. That is the final glass ceiling for minority executives, is that similar to you, when I became a director, I thought that was it. I'm here, I'm going to sit. I'm fine. Life is good. This is what I'm being allowed to do. And so I'm just going to do this to the best of my ability. because again, I had that oppressive glass ceiling um, in front of me. It wasn't placed in front of me by anyone that I work with. It was brought from my childhood forward.
You brought it with you.
Yes, exactly. And so that to me is always the final glass for us. It is the final glass, and it's the hardest one to break, to crack, and to get through. And even as you move through your VP level, and now you're head of diversity and equity inclusion for a global company, how are you now positioning yourself to move some of those oppressive glass ceilings, and then how you're enabling your counterparts who don't look like you to understand it only takes one to ignite the next Eric? So help the audience understand, what are you doing today?
So in my role, there's an official capacity as the global DEI officer for Genesys. And there's a number of, initiatives and things that we have in play. A big part of it is education and awareness.
Right.
Genesys is we celebrated our 31st year this past October, but for 30 years, this is the first time that we've been taking a more intentional, forward-thinking approach around the work itself. And so we've got a very dynamic and multicultural leadership team. Because we're a global company, it comes from all over the place. But they've had limited exposure. The majority of them have had limited exposure to what this work is. So the first part of the journey was just creating awareness and trying to, drive a common language. What is diversity, equity, and inclusion? How does it show up at Genesys? What does it mean within the context of our environment? How do we establish a common language around it? And how do we get people's heads and hearts around the work so they can know what role they play? And we started a 6-part series that we just wrapped this past November with our C-suite, where I curated a set of educational webinars on the work. It started with a history of how institutional racism was instantiated by design. There's no longer an argument about that. There's no longer a debate about that. That is real. And it wasn't just in the US. It was the result of colonization around the globe. So different cultures in different parts of the world have their own institutional isms: racism, colorism, ageism, feminism, whatever it may be. So it started with that education, and it was in a formal way. And then what I do from time to time to try to make it more relatable is to pepper in my own personal stories. And I share my personal stories similar to what I'm sharing here. It requires a little bit of vulnerability, requires some courage, because I never want any of them to look at me as a victim. And I'm very clear with that. I tell you the story to try to give you permission to tell your story, because everybody has a story.
Correct.
Everybody at some point has been excluded from something. You know what it feels like to be excluded. Everyone at some point has probably been ostracized or have felt some type of adversity, right? From one of these isms. I mean, I don't care who you are, because we have a lot of female leaders in the C-suite as well.
Right.
And so I make it relatable to them through the formal education and through the personal stories, and allowing them to come on their own personal journey. And that has been the difference maker for us, in my opinion, over the past year and a half that we've been at this, that allowed us to really move the needle on a number of initiatives at Genesys through the DEI lens. I mean, we've set corporate diversity goals. We're in a small minority of companies who actually have defined goals. They're a part of our corporate KPIs, and we report them out to the board, we report them out to the analysts. And there are a number of other things that I won't go in here that we do that is part of our journey, but it came from the powers that be recognizing this is legitimate work. It's something that is a business imperative, and it's something that needs to be part of our culture. And oh, by the way, as a leader and an influencer, this is the role that I have to play in making this real across the enterprise.
My friend, that was unbelievably awesome. Again, thank you for your candidness here. Thank you for what you're doing at Genesys. Thank you for joining me. Your responses have been awesome. There's certain times here I got a little choked up. I had to take a little break, but I think the audience is going to appreciate your story, the struggles and triumphs that you brought forth. Thank you for joining me on this ride. And as I always leave with the audience, they can't be what they can't see.
Yeah.
Help, and allow them to see and understand that that oppressive veil that Eric discussed can be easily removed by you taking the time.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, man. It was good to see you.
Good to see you, my friend. To the audience, appreciate you. Thanks for the ride.